The sun is not a star. I was 12 years old the first time I heard my father mutter those words. He had just retired from NASA, and though he was only in his early 40s, he looked like a man who had walked through a nightmare. One evening, as I quietly watched him, he sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the fading sunset. My father had once been a hero to me. He was strong and warm, a father who would give me hugs that I would disappear into. But something had changed. Now, he looked at me and my mother as if we were the strangers, as if we were apparitions from another life. Before his retirement, my dad had been the face of our family's pride. He had worked on the International Space Station, Mars rover projects, even met one of the presidents. His stories of space and science were the stuff of my childhood dreams. I remember him once saying,
"Hayden, one day you might be out there, seeing the stars up close."
But when I told him later that I wanted to be an astronaut, he just looked away.
"Promise me you won't follow my path,"
he said.
"There's nothing good about the sun. There's nothing good out there."
It was like a punch to my 12-year-old heart. I couldn't understand why the man who had once loved the stars would speak so bitterly of them now. I felt my resentment simmering as his mind continued to spiral downward, slipping further into realms of his own making. He began to scream at night, waking up in cold sweats, muttering things like,
"It's not a star, it's the Nexus Gates."
At some point, my mother and I had no choice but to send him to a mental health facility. I tried to tell myself he was just suffering from the stress of his career. I didn't know how much deeper it went until one day I found his journal. The leather-bound book was tucked away in his old briefcase, one he'd brought home from NASA. The brittle pages crackled as I opened it, and a strange chill washed over me. Sketches of a strange facility filled the first few pages, an enormous dome with steel spires that spiraled into the sky. In one drawing, the dome stood against a sky filled with stars. On another, a symbol was inked on the side, a six-winged eagle, 3 pairs fanning out on either side. My father's handwriting changed on those pages, the calm and steady script of a scientist turning frantic and rushed, like the claw marks of someone scratching out the last of their sanity.
February 17th, 2017. We arrived on the moon base. The Protectorate insisted this would be a quick mission. Keep watch for anomalies, they said, though what they meant was UFOs. Not what I signed up for, but I'd never been briefed so cryptically either. The base's director, a man named John Valley, gathered us for an orientation. He told us UFO doesn't mean aliens, but we're not ruling it out. Oddly ominous, even for NASA.
The deeper I read, the more unsettling it became. Dad's journal painted a picture of something he'd uncovered with his team, a technology he'd called Nexus Gates. These gates were capable of connecting different universes, dimensions we couldn't understand. He'd hinted that their very existence implied an endless series of possible worlds, like stacked mirrors reflecting into infinity.
March 7th, 2017. Tomorrow's the big day. Project Lighthand will harness the sun's energy indefinitely. They assure us it's safe, but Damien, one of the lead engineers, thinks it's a terrible risk. He says the sun's reactor might overload. I told him not to worry. But in truth, something doesn't sit right with me. And the sight of the sun, it feels wrong, as if it's watching.
By now, the entries were hardly coherent. My father had written about the sun changing color. A deep, menacing blue, surrounded by a red energy field.
Waves of energy pulsed out from it, and I could almost hear the collective horror of everyone witnessing it.
His words tumbled out in frantic script. desperate to capture what no one was meant to comprehend. Then I reached the passage that broke my heart.
March 8th, 2017. It all went wrong. The sun, no, the thing masquerading as the sun, exploded, sending shockwaves through space. We stood in the observatory, watching in helpless terror as the space station orbiting above was torn to shreds. I was in a trance, numb as Earth vanished before my eyes. Just gone. All life, all beauty obliterated.
I closed the journal, hands cold and shaking. What was I supposed to believe? His writing read like the ravings of a madman, yet my father was an astronaut, not a conspiracy theorist, and he'd always been honest with me before. He hadn't written these words to scare me. He'd written them because, somehow, he thought I needed to know. As the days went by, I became obsessed with his notes. My mind reeled with questions I couldn't shake. Was the sun really not a star? And what were the Nexus Gates? Eventually, I visited him in the facility. He looked at me with hollow eyes, yet for a brief moment, a glimmer of recognition flickered in his gaze. I mustered the courage to ask him what really happened out there. He didn't answer right away, but slowly, as if lifting a weight too heavy to bear, he began to speak.
The sun is no star, Hayden. It's a gate, a barrier between us and them.
His voice was barely a whisper, his eyes darting, as if watching invisible shapes just beyond the room.
They told us we could harness it for infinite energy.
He continued, his voice cracking.
But when we did, the sun changed. It became something alive, malevolent, and it obliterated Earth. We, those of us left, we saw it happen.
I wanted to tell him that Earth was still here, that I was still here, but the words died in my throat. Something about his story, the conviction in his tone, and the torment in his eyes made it impossible to argue. He spoke one last time.
I went back, through a Nexus Gate to undo it. And they made me sign everything away again. But the sun is still watching, still waiting. And if we ever disturb it again...
He trailed off, staring at some invisible horror. That night, I dreamed of a blue sun pulsing in the sky, its red aura swirling with hatred, and I woke drenched in sweat, hearing my father's voice echoing in my mind.
The sun is no star.
In the end, I left my dream of working at NASA behind, despite everything I'd ever wanted. My father's words became my constant shadow. I never told anyone his story, but every morning as the sun rises, I can't help but wonder if it's watching us too.